Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. My name is Tarah Wheeler. I am a Cybersecurity Policy Fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. I'll be your moderator today for our panel on the Internet of Things and the regulatory environment that is challenging each and every one of us in this room and around the world to come up with a way to keep people safe and still innovate. It's my pleasure to introduce to you today our distinguished panelists. Mr. Lim Sun-Chia Lim is Director of Cybersecurity Engineering Center and Head Certification Body of the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. Mr. Neville Matthew is a General Manager in the Consumer Product Safety area of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission and is the Chair of the OECD Working Party on Consumer Product Safety. Ms. Ursula Pachl is the Deputy Director General of BEUC, the European Consumer Organization. Mr. Stephen Pattison is currently VP Public Affairs at ARM. Mr. Atsushi Umino is Director, Office of the Director General for Cybersecurity and the Japanese Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications. It's a pleasure to have you all with us today, and I think the reason that we have so much interest in the topic of IoT is the interesting conflicts that come between innovating and developing products that can make people's lives better, and at the same time considering some of the risks that are associated with devices that for individual consumers may pose little to no harm, but en masse could create deeper social harms. So we'll ask this question today: how can policymakers address the IoT digital security challenge? We come to this conversation after having seen examples globally of how a lack of IoT regulation has caused challenges for populations, for citizens, when an event such as the Mirai botnet in September of 2016 occurred, where multiple webcams were taken over and used in a DNS bot that took down the eastern coast of the United States internet. These kinds of consumer devices were not individually harmful, but when molded together into a botnet army, became something that could have an outsized and extraordinary impact. This kind of interesting technical challenge not only can be seen replicated in multiple other countries, but is also something that keeps policymakers, technologists, manufacturers up at night. So as we have this conversation, I would like to begin by asking our panelists today the question: what IoT issue facing policymakers and consumers is at the top of your mind? I'd like to begin, if possible, with Ursula Pachl. It would be a pleasure to hear from you, ma'am.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be here and contribute to this really interesting and important event today. On top of our mind, coming from a consumer perspective, is that there is a real problem out there when it comes to consumer smart goods, and the fact that there is very often not at all security measures built into these products, or very little. And so consumers are really exposed to significant risks. We all know that these products, they come on the market. There is a big and ever increasing proliferation of smart goods, and consumers are actually pushed to buy these products. But the security flaws that were mentioned by Tarah, they have not been addressed, despite the fact that, for example, the organizations I represent, national consumer organizations across the European Union, they have done a lot of product testing in the past years. And the result is really very worrying. It shows that very often more than half of the tested products, they come with no security or very insignificant and not sufficient security measures. Maybe just to mention a few, our Belgium member Tasha, they did a test about smart homes. So they hired a few hackers and gave them a few days. And nearly all the products, like ranging from smart fridge, thermostat, printer, a door lock, alarm system, etc., could be hacked and taken control over. And that can be really dangerous if you think about a smoke detector that becomes mute, if you think about a lock, a house lock, a door lock that can be opened. and it could be cameras where you can see inside the house. Our UK member Which said it's the same with other smart gadgets, like speaking about connected toys or normal cameras that could be very easily hacked. And so the same conclusion across the European Union is we have a big problem with these products on the market, and the risk, and sorry to say, Tarah, I think it's really important to look not only at the common good and the overall economic and societal risk that we see, but this is really about the risk that individuals have. And I'm speaking about not only physical harm, so injuries that comes when something could be set on fire because it hacks, or a thermostat could go much too far and heat up a house. But I speak about data loss that can also come with economic losses, privacy invasion, and you finally could have appliances that just do not work any longer, or that don't have updates, and you cannot at all use them any longer. And 3 years ago, actually, the Director General of our organization, she made a presentation at this very conference where she came with a toy, my friend Kyla, and she alerted, as we did already since 2016, about the problems that consumers face and are exposed to the risks. And nothing has changed since then. And that's really what I would like to discuss today. The framework that the European Union has put in place just does not address these individual concerns, these problems of an individual household. And so there is a real need for action, also because there is a lot of talk about trust that consumers should really have in the digital environment, in the digital economy, but we don't see that happen if you cannot trust that the products that surround you, that they can be trusted and that there is no problem. So what I wanted to conclude with is that what we need is a consumer right to security. We have a right to safety. We have high standards in the European Union when it comes to product safety, but we need to have the same for consumers' security. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Ursula. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you here. I'd love to invite now Neville Matthew from the other side of the globe over in Australia to have a word with us as well about what the IoT policy issue is that keeps you up at night, Neville. You're on mute still.
My apologies. Thanks very much, Tarah. And I might touch on some similar issues, but perhaps from a different perspective. I mean, really, my concern is, are our regimes fit for purpose and ready to do the task? And I think, sadly, the answer is probably no. Up until recently, consumer product safety regimes have really focused on direct physical hazards from products. But IoT products are really forcing a rethink. And I understand across the globe, many governments have product safety officials that are asking the question if our focus needs to shift from the product to some broader notion of consumer safety. So while IoT products are controlled in the digital world, they manifest a safety risk for us because they execute actions in the physical world, where doors are unlocked, as Ursula's mentioned, temperatures can be altered, appliances manipulated. So this means that the consumers can really impact the way products are used by simple things like Wi-Fi power plugs that in Australia cost $20, which enable products to be operated remotely even if they weren't intended to be. So the performance and safety of products being altered by inputs from other parties after the product was designed and placed on the market, and often in circumstances well beyond the knowledge of a manufacturer, is really problematic and blurs the existing notions of liability and responsibility. I would say that in a better world, regulation would advance at the speed of innovation, or at least close to it. However, in the real world, technology landscape is moving so quickly. I feel that governments are really struggling to implement effective regulatory frameworks. And tech-enabled disruption doesn't seem to be slowing down, and many innovators are impatient to push forward, often without guidance. So I'm really troubled at trying to see how to harness the benefits, encourage innovation while managing safety risks. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Neville. It's helpful to hear from that side of the house in terms of keeping people safe. I'd like to remind our audience and viewers today that you have the opportunity, and we would definitely ask you to ask questions via the questions tab in the event platform, and we'll get to some of those questions a little bit later on. We'll continue to speak with our panelists, and in a moment or two, we'll have a bit of a debate on the consumer labeling schemes that are popping up everywhere, which I anticipate being lively, and I hope you'll participate as we are today as well. All right, if I could, thank you so much for that, Neville. If I could ask Stephen, could you tell us what IoT policy issues are concerning you right now that bring you here today?
Look, yeah, thank you very much, Tarah. And thanks also, Ursula, for her introductory remarks to this, which I think, laid out the issues very clearly. And what is it that I worry about? What I worry about is precisely that unless we have trust in digital technology, whether it's Internet of Things or whatever it is, unless we have trust in it, we will never be able to realize the benefits which we, I think, all believe that technology can bring to society in all sorts of ways, to improve the way we use our resources, to improve the way we deliver services. They're huge benefits. But without trust, none of this is going to happen, or it's going to be, at best, half-hearted. So we do need to build trust. And I think where I think sometimes we collectively all make a mistake is that we expect too much of consumers. Consumers, I think, have a right to expect that the products they will buy have been somehow approved by someone somewhere and meet certain minimum standards of safety or security. I'm going to put those two things together for the purposes of this conversation. So that means that we as a sector and as those interested in this, we need to find a way to drive up what I call security by design. It's a phrase that people have used for a long time. We need to make sure that, in the same way in which if you're building a car, you work right from the start to make sure the thing is safe and secure. We need to make sure that people designing Internet of Things devices are motivated in the same way. Of course, it's a bit harder because there's a relatively small number of car manufacturers in the world, and there are, we hope, many, many, many more manufacturers of digital or connected devices. And a lot of them are at the cutting edge of innovation, and obviously we don't want to make it harder for them to innovate than is compatible with ensuring sort of minimum safety standards. So what we need is a way in which we can make it easy for developers to design products which are safe and secure. And I think my last point in the 120 seconds I had here is this. There is actually quite a lot going on in this space, right? There is a lot of talk in a number of capitals around the world about whether and how to regulate for more security. Brussels is looking at it. London is looking at it. There are bits, at any rate, of the Washington establishment which are looking at it. So there's a lot of recognition that there is a bit of a problem here. There are some intractable problems, we know, but some standards are emerging in the United States. NIST has got a standard in Europe. ETSI has produced a standard. So there's coalescence around what good looks like in this space. So I think, the picture isn't entirely bleak. What we need now is to accelerate progress in building products that are secure by design, using the tools that both governments and the private sector and civil society have at their disposal to drive up awareness and to drive up demand for more secure products.
Thank you so very much. Appreciate it, Stephen. May I ask, Atsushi, would you be able to tell us what IoT policy issue concerns you today? And I believe that Matthew can assist with your slides now.
Thank you, Tarah. And could you show up my slides? Actually, I'm a policymaker, so my concern is basically on the policy making, on how to enhance the IoT security without hindering the market mechanism and innovation. And from this perspective, we amended a ministerial ordinance in 2019 to require IoT terminal equipment to take minimum security measures, such as access control and setting a password, having features to encourage users to change initial passwords, as well as to update firmware. And these requirements do not apply to personal computers or smartphones that are generally protected by other security measures, such as antivirus software. And please turn on the next page. And along with this regulatory approach, we implement some technical projects with the NICT, which is a National Research Institute, in order to provide alert with users of vulnerable IoT devices by using an observational network called NICTA that monitors traffic to unused IP addresses. And one of the projects is called Notice. And this project was started in February 2019 to investigate vulnerable IoT devices that have possibilities to be infected with malware and to alert their users to any identified problems with the help of the ISPs. Actually, the NICT tried to log into devices which have weak passwords, such as a series of the same characters, which need their settings to be changed. And next slide, please. And another project is called NICTA Alert and started in June 2019. And this project is operated to identify IoT devices actually infected with malware. And the NICT identifies devices that are generating malware-infected traffic and provides information on them to ISPs so that they can alert users of the malware. And next slide, please. Next page, please. And in addition to this project, we have been taking measures to enhance the security of critical IoT devices, such as water gauges of the river. And it detects some vulnerable state where some important information, such as the name of the operators or the place of the facilities, is shown in the website, which is easily accessible by the internet. And after that, we ask managers of the devices to find how they control them and propose some measures to ameliorate the managing method and follow some procedures to complete such measures. But with this kind of sort of a two-way method of enhancing IoT security, we implement these kind of policy actions. And that is our introduction of our activities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Atsushi. I would love to ask Chia to join us and to describe what IoT policy issue is concerning you today.
Yeah, thank you, Tarah, for the question. Really, on top of our mind is how to effectively respond to the increasing security challenges brought about by the proliferation and the connectivity of the IoT devices that are largely not built securely. And there are three issues here related to consumer, developer, and the economy. So for consumer, currently the cybersecurity provisions of the IoT devices are largely opaque to the general consumer. So we need to make such provisions more transparent to the users, and in the process, educate and enhance their awareness of cybersecurity risk. In this way, we hope to change the consumer's mindset and imbue a cybersecurity consciousness in them, and to help them to make informed decisions when purchasing such IoT devices. Related to the developer, beyond enforcing a compliance regime on the developers, we also wanted to have a more sustainable and proactive approach to incentivize them to develop more secure products. So through the changing attitude of the consumer, we hope that this will in turn incentivize the developers to produce more secure products. And by doing so, it will also help the developers to differentiate their product from competition and achieve quality branding. Related to economy, we also wanted to grow a vibrant digital economy through greater international collaborations and mutual recognitions of standards and conformity assessment. And in this way, we hoped to eradicate duplicated testing across border, reduce cost of compliance, and to improve market access. And premise on the above, Singapore actually has launched a cybersecurity labeling scheme since last October. And being just more than 6 months or more than half a year, we are very pleased that the scheme is gaining much momentum. And there are labeled products across the spectrum of categories that are already now available in both physical stores and online shops.
Thank you, Sun Chia. In fact, I'd actually love to ask you to extend upon that. I would very much like to know, as IoT devices do pose greater and greater concerns to the world, especially as more and more consumer devices are connected to the internet, knowingly or unknowingly. I sit here and think to myself of the room I'm in right now, where I just purchased a small window air conditioner that has wireless embedded in it. I ask myself, what inspired Singapore to create the cybersecurity labeling scheme? It was recently mentioned by US officials as an inspiration for the consumer labeling portion of the recent President Biden executive order on cybersecurity in the United States. What brought this about, and how difficult was it to get a consumer level cybersecurity labeling scheme into play?
Thanks. Actually, we started to think about this problem quite some time back, given the fast pace of digitalization and the proliferation of smart systems and IoT devices in Singapore, driven by our vision of becoming a smart nation. From 2016, we started holding an international IoT security roundtable, which is held annually as part of our Singapore International Cyber Week SICW, essentially to galvanize global community to build a secure and trusted global IoT ecosystem. And the objective is to share, shape, and steer, to share ideas and experiences, to shape technologies and architectures, and to actually steer standards and practices. And result from that series of conferences, in 2019, we jointly released a IoT security landscape report together with our counterparts from the Netherlands. We have drawn much of the aspiration or inspiration from the key findings, which I will highlight three. First, relating to the evaluation and conformity regime, was that with the quick obsolescence of emerging technology, such as IoT, the traditional evaluation and certification scheme does not seem to be compatible. And second, related to the ecosystem development and to avoid the issue of the global internet of forgotten things, we need to have a more responsible and security conscious industry. And not one just to be able to design securely, but also to provide continuous maintenance and life cycle support. And third, about standard, we need to start to develop global security standards to set baseline for security assurance and interoperability, and therein to support export facilitation and to grow a digital industry or economy together. So that was the genesis of our cybersecurity labeling scheme. And our inspiration actually brought us to develop the scheme with a few important attributes. First is flexibility. The scheme is actually a combination of self-declaration and third-party independent assessment. So there are 4 levels. Level 1 and 2 involve self-declaration, while level 3 and 4 involves independent third-party evaluation. Well, so it can be lightweight if basic hygiene is sought. Otherwise, for high assurance, you can go for a level 3 or 4. And this allows water to find its level. And this 4-level construct actually recognize that no one size fits all. And because it is flexible, it allows water to find its level. So different devices can find its own level depending on the risk profile and also depending on the spectrum of factors such as market demand, technology maturity, and the product readiness. So actually this ties in very well with our real-world experiences. For some of the simple products like switches and all that, I mean, the OEM will go for level 1, but for some of the more critical products like routers and all that, they may straight away go for level 4. So this allows us to strike a delicate balance of raising cyber hygiene while continuing to encourage innovations and advance of new products. In this way, we don't stifle innovation, but over time, we can progressively nudge the markets towards the higher security requirements based on a number of factors as mentioned earlier. Third is that we don't let perfection be the enemy of good. In this case, our cybersecurity scheme actually started on a voluntary basis as a soft lever. Right? This allows us to operationalize the scheme very fast, and clearly it is not going to be perfect, but it allows us to learn along the way and fine-tune it, fine-tune the scheme and improve upon it where it matters. However, where there are important devices, we work selectively with the sector regulator to mandate the adoption of a cybersecurity scheme. And the case in point is that we work very closely with our telco regulator to mandate the adoption of CLS in residential gateway, or what we commonly call the home Wi-Fi router, which is an important part of the digital infra. So by end of October this year, all home Wi-Fi routers sold in Singapore would have to meet the CLS level 1 requirement. And fourth, robust. As explained earlier, we took a more comprehensive approach, not just only focus on compliance of the developers, but also we create a we also make sure that the cybersecurity scheme is the cybersecurity provision is transparent and change the cybersecurity mindset of the user. So we focus on the consumer as well. And of course, we know that we also want to work with like-minded partners to eradicate the duplicated testing, reduce cost of compliance, and to facilitate market access. And so that is where we are right now, trying to operationalize our cybersecurity scheme. And importantly, I think we think that global action is really critical in this, and greater harmonizations of the various schemes would be useful in actually building together a more secured and trusted IoT ecosystem for the world. Thank you.
That's it. Thank you so much, Chia. We actually have a wonderful question from the audience on your topic right at the moment. I have to admit, I'm curious to know as well, too. What happens, and this question comes from Stella Horschen, what happens after the consumers are notified? Are there active measures then taken beyond this notification, and what happens then?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Notified in terms of?
How do you notify?
A hack?
How do you notify the consumers after something happens? How do you reach out to them? What happens after they've been notified? Do you take any active measures? What's the next step?
Okay, so when there's a hack reported or whatever, actually part of the basic requirement of the cybersecurity scheme is actually to have an open vulnerability disclosure framework, so that it allows. I mean, there's really no cybersecurity is perfect. I mean, the most perfect computer is probably still in the box, right? So this open disclosure framework allows then the vulnerability or the attacks to be actually reported, so that the vendors or the developers could actually, in a very timely manner, to fix the problem, and to make sure that where it is possible, to make sure that their software patch are updated, right?
Yes, thank you. It's wonderful to hear that. It's wonderful to hear that the process has been thought through and is being implemented in a way that starts from the very beginning and ends with actually taking action to help people at the end of the day. It's good to hear it. That's what we're here to do, is make sure that the fixes end up with the people who are purchasing these products and need to be protected. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. And on that process, a different perspective is taken by Atsushi in Japan. Japan uses a minimum regulatory framework that focuses on private industry. Can you describe some of the lessons learned in protecting consumer safety and the Internet of Things learned from that approach?
Thank you. Actually, in Japan, all the equipment that is connected with the network must have some certain requirements from the technical perspective. And those kind of requirements are stipulated in the law and ministerial ordinances. And as far as the IoT devices is concerned, as I said, recently new requirements such as access control or changing the passwords have been added to the ministerial ordinances. And telecommunications operators can't refuse the connection as far as the IoT devices have such functions or satisfy the requirements stipulated in the law and ministerial ordinances. From this framework, we try to respect the market mechanism as much as possible, because if we impose heavy regulations, or if we take too much regulatory actions, it can hinder the market mechanism. That's why we take the minimum approach. And with regards to the newly added IoT device security requirement, it only applies to the IoT devices which has been produced after 2019. It is not retroactive. So in that, it means that some old IoT devices can be vulnerable. So that's why we implement the two kinds of projects that I introduced, which is Notice and Nicter Alert. This is in conjunction with the NICT, which is a National Research and Development Institute. And the National Research and Development Institute, which is called NICT, has a observation network called NICTA. This catch observe the traffic of the unused IP traffic that is has been that can be seen in the unused IP traffic. So if we find some dubious traffic in the through the NICTA, we can easily find that the IoT devices which is vulnerable or already infected with malware. So we try to provide some alerts to the IoT device users with the help of the ISPs. And in Japan, most of the developers and operators in terms of the IoT devices are very obedient to the governmental regulations or governmental promotions. So that's why we try to have the very loose regulatory framework. So, and with that kind of projects, we believe that those kind of measures are quite effective. But in recent years, newly IoT devices have been developed again and again. So this means that even if those kind of Nicter alert and notice project is effective, we have to tackle with the problem with the newly developed IoT devices. It's a sort of a cat and mouse problem. So that's why actually the number of the alert cases has been flat in recent years. The reason is what I have explained. So in sum, I believe that our activities is quite effective in enhancing the IoT security, but we still have further our efforts to identify the vulnerable devices. That's our overall picture of our activities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Atsushi. I believe Ursula has a question for you. If you'd like to please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Atsushi, for this very interesting, for the description of the system that you apply in Japan. My question now, with the background of the European experience that we have, is what happens to consumers that have bought such a product that is then identified as being vulnerable? And if there is notice, I mean, are the manufacturers or developers able to remedy the situation quickly and without any negative consequences for consumers? We have seen in Europe with this example that I brought with the doll, that consumers just had in one country, in Germany, they had no permission to have the doll any longer because it was identified as a spyware, and then they wouldn't even get their money back because they would have just to give up, having that at home. And very often we see that consumers are the one that lose out, and manufacturers are sometimes not even able to remedy the security flaw in good time and to a satisfactory result. I just wonder how you deal with these situations.
Thank you for your question. Overall, in my opinion, the general consumers' awareness to IoT security in Japan is not so high, in fact. So, in that sense, most of the general consumers has to make efforts, has to make more efforts, and the government, which is our side, also has to promote to raise the awareness of the general public on the IoT security. But at the same time, if something happens on the IoT devices, most of the developers or manufacturers will handle the issues to ameliorate the situation in Japan. But it depends on the awareness of the developers and manufacturers. So it varies according to each developers and manufacturers. So in that sense, we created an IoT security guidelines, which is mostly for targeted for manufacturers and developers to enhance the activities of the IoT security, as well as to promote the awareness of the IoT security. So with regards to the governmental activities, we try to promote the awareness. And as I said, both NICTR alert and notice project, in the NICTR alert and notice project, we provide alerts to users via the ISPs. But normal IoT consumers would not notice it because the alert will be sent by the email. So if, for example, if I get the email for the alert, and if I carefully check it, I can amend it, amend the situation very soon. But some users are not aware of it very quickly. So in that sense, we are now considering to take a different alerting system. For example, if the alert will be provided from the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, many users will quickly check it and and try to find it, what happened. So that kind of alerting system or alerting method is also important, we believe. So in that sense, we are in the progress of the amelioration of the situation. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Atsushi. I was glad to hear that. And speaking of the kind of regulation that does need to come from central agencies, I'd love to come at this from a very different perspective and ask Stephen if I could here. Coming from the side of the manufacturers, the innovators themselves, you've described security flaws in consumer products as a market failure. As one of the biggest semiconductor companies in the world and one of the most important foundational part manufacturers for the Internet of Things, how can we use the market's fundamental forces to balance innovation and consumer protection, especially when you can create devices by so many different sellers for the same kinds of parts?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Tarah. And some of the issues we've already touched on. I mean, there is a huge issue around legacy products, which has just been touched on. You know, what do you do with stuff that came into the market before new regulations were adopted, and so on. But the market failure derives, I think, from two things. One, it derives from the point I made at the beginning, really, which we can't expect too much of consumers. I mean, if you look at the basic security requirements from an IoT device, you look at the NIST list, you look at the IoT Security Foundation list, they meet half of them or whatever. So that, I think, is one issue around the behavior of the market. The second is a mismatch of incentives. We spoke earlier about various DDoS attacks, a denial of service attacks, where if you've got a CCTV camera that's monitoring your porch and it's connected to the internet, you may not mind someone hacking it because you're not bothered about what they see is going on in your porch, but someone could hack into it and use it to bombard and paralyze another institution, a hospital, a police station, a power station, or something like that. And you're saying, that's not my problem. That ought to be someone else's problem. So I'm not willing to pay more to have a more security device to protect the hospital. So those are the kind of market failure issues here. And it's because of that we really do need to try to drive up security as a kind of default position on the part of manufacturers. Now, regulation will have a role to play in it, probably, but also trying to get better behavior among companies that are developing IoT devices will be very crucial. And there's a number of ways in which people are already starting to do that. There are a number of checklists, as I said, both by independent organizations, by governmental organizations, by private companies, which outline basic security. And really what we need to happen is for some of the big players to say, actually, I'm not going to put out an IoT device unless it meets some of those criteria, or all of those criteria, or these basic ones of that checklist. And at the same time, various companies are trying to make that as easy as possible, so that instead of, if you're a small developer, you might be looking at one of these lists, and as I say, it's got dozens of things on it, but there are already emerging in the market products which essentially will enable you to say, if you buy this particular chip, that already meets certain of the criteria required in the NIST or the ETSI baselines, and if you get this certified software, that already meets certain of the requirements of these various international baselines. So I think that's the way we're going to have to try to drive the market. I'm not sure it'd be enough. I mean, I think what we need to do is to make sure that increasingly in the jurisdictions represented on this panel, standards are both set by the government to be very high, but also consumers do have an expectation that their products will meet high standards, and that will slowly drive the manufacturers to take security, even more seriously. I mean, I do agree with, I think it was Chia who said, but security is marketable, right? From the point of view, I think, of a company manufacturing this kit, we ought to get to the position where if you put it on the market and you say this meets all the current baseline security for IoT agreed internationally or whatever, that should be a marketable point, in the same way in which some of the Silicon Valley companies have tried to market end-to-end encryption as a selling point for their devices. I think we should aim to get to a position where IoT companies actually want to advertise that their products are secure, because they know that that will get them into high-end markets.
I'd love to ask Chia to ask a question of you.
Well, actually, I want to raise what Stephen mentioned earlier on, that actually the situation is not so bleak, with many of the communities actually establishing their standards and guidelines. For example, ETS I303645, which actually our cybersecurity labeling scheme reference heavily on, and there's also NIST 8259. But my real point is that all roads lead to Rome. And I think we had more similarities than differences among the various schemes. And to me, the greatest concern I gathered from many vendors is the risk of standards fragmentization. and having two disparate schemes that may increase the cost of doing business without necessarily enhancing cybersecurity. So importantly, I think we are all heading for the same outcome to improve IoT hygiene and a more secure and trusted IoT ecosystem. So I strongly believe that we can certainly build on the similarity and harmonize among the differences, different nuances in approaches across the different country, and to achieve certain levels of mutual recognitions. And together, I think we can make this world a safer and more trusted IoT ecosystem.
I mean, if I can.
That's a wonderful sentiment. Oh, actually, let me ask Stephen, if possible, if we could complete the rest of the key questions here.
Yeah, go on.
Yes, and just because we're running so short on time here, if I could ask everyone, if possible, responses and questions just down to 1 minute, because I know we're all looking forward to that labeling debate in a moment. Let's give plenty of time for that. And I would actually like to take Chia's wonderful sentiments about how we can do this together and point over to Neville now to ask, as we are trying to create these solutions together, we've heard these kinds of concerns from the cybersecurity side. Now, as you come from the consumer product safety side, can you describe some of these concerns you have as you are building into this debate from this perspective that you have, especially with elements of safety in consumer products?
Oh, thanks very much, Tarah. I mean, I would like to elaborate on what I said earlier about products and what product safety officials are calling hazardization. And we see that this can happen in a number of ways. I did mention Wi-Fi power plugs. Some products that were only ever designed to be used by a human locally can now have at least some operations triggered remotely. A cooktop stove or a benchtop stove, an electric heater can be turned on remotely, whereas in the past there had to be that local human interaction. And if an electric heater has been moved during a day by someone else in the house and is then triggered remotely by someone coming home, it's easy to see how a fire or other incident can occur. We're also concerned that hazardization might occur if software updates aren't delivered for the actual working life of a product. And this does in some ways touch on confidence and trust in the market. But if a product doesn't receive updates, particularly a safety product, and it doesn't operate as intended, and I think Ursula touched on smoke alarms not activating, not alerting, and fire suppression systems not being activated. And whilst it's not perhaps directly product safety, it's that broader notion of consumer safety. The hazardization can also be triggered by malicious third parties. And why hackers hack, there are many reasons. Some are obvious in some cases, like information theft or personal harassment. And where we have, had reports and seen things where things like temperature control can be used to harass people. But it's not just excessive heat and fire. That sort of freezers being manipulated to thaw and refreeze could create some health issues. But finally, why hackers want to disrupt the broader public services that Stephen mentioned isn't clear to me, but these vulnerabilities are real, and they're on a continuum from consumer product safety through consumer safety to then public safety. And if we're in a position where that critical infrastructure, such as traffic lights, power grids, water supplies, can be compromised, that's a major policy concern for governments. Even if it's not directly a product safety responsibility, someone in a government will be asked to look at that. Thanks.
Thank you. And I actually would love, Neville, if I could, to direct a question to you from the audience that's so relevant, and it builds in on that Internet of Forgotten Things that have already been mentioned several times as well. How do we avoid something like that Internet of Forgotten Things, or consumer products past their safe lifespan, and in essence trying to prevent something like a WannaCry of IoT? Should policies require IoT manufacturers to open source the code of their products after the end of life in order to allow others to maintain them? Would this be a better or worse solution for safety at the end of life of products?
I'm certainly no expert in coding, but if there is a mechanism where consumers can, their safety can be maintained at the end of the expected service life of a product. That is something that could be considered as an option. One of the challenges of dealing with consumers is consumers are subject to biases, and we've done a lot of work at the OECD about the biases that affect consumers' response to warnings and notices. So consumers can suffer from information overload. They can be over-optimistic about risk. They can have some inertia. And someone mentioned earlier, they might enjoy using a particular product and they become reluctant to surrender that product, particularly if there's not a replacement provided. So I don't know if it is the answer, but it sounds like something that could be considered. There'll obviously be commercial ramifications about that, but I'd be delighted to hear what other people on the panel also think about that. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think this is a fascinating discussion so far to figure out the different perspectives, approaches, lessons learned that we're all taking in order to try to both keep people safe and try to come to some kind of socially optimal outcome, while at the same time just letting people build fun things and put them on the internet. And now, speaking of building fun things and putting them on the internet, Ursula, if we can have a conversation with you, you'd already brought up my friend Kyla. It's only one of the examples of consumer products that the EU has experienced these issues with in terms of severe security vulnerabilities. Can you describe your goals in regulating and protecting EU consumers, and how do you prevent a crazy doll like that in the future?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tarah, for that. And that's exactly the point, because this crazy doll can still be sold in Europe. So this is not over, despite the fact that we have raised the issue and brought it to the authorities in 2016. And let me just also in that context mention what I just heard before, and I would agree to that. There is movement in the policy discussion, and I think there is an increased readiness of policymakers across the globe probably to address the issue. But looking at it from a consumer perspective on the ground of what is on the market, I have not heard from our consumer organizations who test these products that there is less dangerous and unsecure products on the market. So the market is still full of these things, and that is really what counts for consumers, despite the policy discussions, maybe a step further, standards, maybe on available already, but what happens on the ground. And this is why, to your question, Tarah, we think there is this failure that we have identified. I agree with a lot what Stephen has said in that respect. There is not enough incentives for manufacturers, for developers, for traders to really bring secure products on the market. So what we think is there needs a mandatory obligation to have baseline security requirements for everybody. So a regulation that brings a fair playing level for everybody, that brings also for the industry, it brings legal certainty. You know what you have to do, and it brings protection to consumers, and it brings trust and a bit better digital environment. So this is why the principle that was also mentioned already, cybersecurity by design, that should be the baseline for building up a regulatory framework. And I would like to add not only cybersecurity by design, but also by default, meaning that the product comes with inbuilt security features and it is handed over to the consumer in a way that by default it comes with a good security level, so that consumers don't have to go through complicated processes to try to get a good security. We have learned a lot of lessons, I think, from the personal data protection and privacy discussion. And we also know, and I would think security is probably even more complicated, that consumers cannot be expected to know what is secure, what is not secure. And this is really why I would caution against calling on putting too much expectations and too much burden on consumers. Consumers have their role to play. Cyber hygiene is important. We all have to do a lot, and our members work a lot to raise awareness of consumers. But the real thing has to come from products that are put only on the market when they come with a certain security baseline. They shouldn't be on the market if they are not. And this is not about voluntary efforts and motivating manufacturers only. It's about telling them, look, you have to do this, otherwise you're not on this market. This is in a nutshell our approach. Maybe just say the European Union has recently, 2 years ago, had a new law, Cybersecurity Act, and again, it comes with voluntary certification systems that you can use. And we think it is just not enough. The market has not reacted. Well, it's early days, but we need to speed up, and regulatory mandatory framework is the only way forward from our perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's disturbing to see that regulatory bodies, you have a great deal of power, and yet at the same time, I look at a situation like this doll and how this is still available. I want to show the audience something right now. This is the website for my friend Kyla in the UK. Let me just go ahead and show you this right now. This is the website for this doll right now, and the website itself has been hacked. It's just sitting up here. It's been pwned. And so we see this kind of thing happening in real life right now. Here's where to go purchase these dolls. And I was looking because I thought to myself, I'm going to go buy a My Friend Kyla doll and perhaps just take a look at the security issues myself. I don't need to buy it anymore to see the problem. This is not done by people who are focused on cybersecurity. And I think it just really calls out and underlines the point that Ursula just made about the fact that simply notifying people sometimes isn't enough. There does need to be some force behind regulations that protect consumers, because this hasn't stopped this doll from selling. So thank you so much for that, Ursula. If any of our panelists have any thoughts on this, I'd love to know. And I'm also happy to go to a Q&A from the audience as well, if anyone has any thoughts. All right. So I took a look at how this builds into a larger conversation. And one of the things that came up again and again as we prepared for this webinar, for this panel, is that there are massively different perspectives on labeling schemes to actually inform customers and consumers about what it is that they're purchasing. And I had just a wonderful discussion with Neville this last Thursday about some of the interesting ways in which we could implement a consumer labeling scheme. Coming from the consumer product safety side, it's always difficult to balance the correct amount of information you want to give someone with the ability to convey something that could be technical or complicated or changing information. And so as we go into this larger debate about labeling in consumer products in IoT, about cybersecurity risks, I'd love to ask Neville, can you tell us, where does the rubber meet the road? Where do we go to find some kind of star rating system? What's the best one you've seen, and what's the worst one you've seen, and where do we go? Where do we start labeling things?
Oh, look, thanks very much, Tarah. And I think some of my thoughts about labelling come from the need for absolute simplicity. You know, the theory behind addressing information asymmetry and helping guide good purchasing decisions is from economics, and economics, as we know, has the rational consumer in mind. Unfortunately, with the biases I mentioned before, the time pressures, different language accessibility, simple things like the size of font and lack of consistent languaging make that challenge to convey meaning to consumers for these sorts of issues really difficult. And what I think it requires is some real standardization about what terms mean and the way that information is presented. And I think, you know, it's been touched on, I think it might have been by Stephen, the idea that you might have a baseline of certain required standards or disclosure about whether it meets those standards, and then having optional criteria that's more relevant to particular types of products. But some of the fundamentals that we'd like to see would be expressed very, very clearly, and where some of the other concepts that have been mentioned already, that where no duplicated default or weak passwords. You know, there should be a statement that makes it clear that that the password will need to meet certain levels of complexity, as well as that concept about how long a product's going to be supported. That idea of disclosing perhaps long-term vulnerabilities. So there's some but it's got to be done in a way that consumers can readily understand, whether they're looking online or at the box of a product at their local computer store. And it's really got to mean something to consumers. And somebody else said something about educating consumers. And I think this is not going to be some quick advertising campaign by government authorities or by industry about looking at these things. It will take considerable time to educate people or consumers what to look for and how they can stay safe online. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I believe Chia has a response to that. If you'd like to go ahead, Chia.
Yeah, I fully agree with Matthew about actually educating consumer and actually having a scheme. There's a labeling scheme that's easy to understand. So actually in Singapore, actually we attempted to have such a scheme, which is a progressive 4-level scheme. And for level 1, actually, it is just to meet 3 basic requirements, such as to ensure, as you mentioned, no unique universal default passwords. And I mentioned earlier, have an open vulnerability disclosure framework, and of course, to provide timely software patches. For level 2, actually, it is actually to develop, have a process in terms of using cybersecurity by design principles. So it has to use the principles of SBD cybersecurity by design, such as conducting the threat risk assessments, critical design reviews, have the acceptance tests, so on and so forth. So these two at level 1 and 2, we are looking at the basic hygiene. So actually it's a self-declaration. Although at the current moment, actually, we do validations of these self-declarations so that there's greater understanding between what we want, what we need, and actually what the developers are doing. And for level 3, we are looking at no known vulnerabilities. So here the product has to undergo assessment of software vulnerabilities by approved third-party test lab. So that actually there's no known vulnerabilities that are still inside the device. And level 4, actually, it is resilient against common attacks, whereby actually it is where we do actually pen testing of specific use cases of such specific products. So actually, we can have a very bespoke pen testing use cases for specific categories of devices. I also like to mention that I think in cybersecurity, I mean, it is really quite dynamic, and it's actually a very emerging technology. So we actually use a mix of soft lever versus hard levers. Soft lever is starting as a voluntary scheme so that we don't stifle innovations, but where it is important, we are working in a very integrated way with the sector regulator to impose or to mandate some basic requirements. Thanks.
Thank you so very much. Absolutely. I believe Ursula has her hand up there. Ursula, if you'd like to respond, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would just say that the question really behind the label, I guess, is probably to influence the purchase decisions of consumers, right? So that they go for the secure products. And here, I think, at least in Europe, we don't have any behavioral research that would lead us to say that, well, if you give consumers this and that information about security, this will have a real impact. And so we will drive up the demand side in terms of that consumers will really influence the market. So we don't really think that this has been shown that this is possible. We are quite skeptical also because, as I said before, security is quite a complex theme. And so far, we have not very good experience with labels that are complicated and require a certain knowledge. I think Neville has said it very well in the beginning. He spoke about simplicity is the guiding idea here, and how can you communicate about security levels and security features in a simpler way? That's a huge question. I haven't seen a proposal for a label that will really qualify from the experience our members have with understanding of consumers that would be able to do that. So our preferred policy option is, again, that first you introduce a baseline for whatever is on the market must meet certain security requirements. And that's also what people expect. They have the same idea for security like they have for safety. So they don't expect unsafe products to be on the market in a first instance, and they don't expect to have to identify and make difficult decisions whether this is now secure enough for their purposes or not. So we will be skeptical and first go for a level playing field of mandatory requirements, and then do a lot of testing and trying to see how consumers really react to labels and do they understand it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If I could call on Stephen at the moment, his hand's not up, but he's not able to see the button right now, so I'll just insert him so we can't hear. Not at all.
Button. It's probably here somewhere, but I just can't see it. And I think Ursula may have made the point I was going to make. I mean, I think we're all in the same place, really. I think we all think that actually some regulation would be a very helpful part of all of this. I think we all think that greater transparency available to consumers in a way they can easily understand is also a very important part of it. I think the question is whether we think that a label on its own, if I can put it that way, it solves the problem. And I think the risk with labels is that it looks like it solves the problem, but it might not, because a label basically looks like it freezes the security judgment at one point in time. And the one thing we do know about all of these gadgets is that, you know, bugs are found in them the minute they leave the factory, right? So the minute they've got a label on them, there may be further security issues. Second, you know, looking at it the other way, the bad actors may all find new ways of undermining the products and hacking into our products. And so we need a system that's going to be flexible. I think what the British government's looking at the moment, they don't exclude labelling, but they're looking at mandating the fact that you can only sell products that meet certain basic standards, but also requiring companies to have on their website some sort of declaration that these products meet these particular standards. And that, I think, might turn out to be more flexible than just sticking a label on. You're on mute.
Fair. No, I was just desperately searching about, but no one can ever find buttons in Zoom. So we need to get a star label for all conferencing equipment. I think at this point, I think everyone would love it. I'd love to call on Chia, and hopefully we could also, as we're doing so, address the question of whether or not in the labeling scheme itself for any kind of consumer safety in IoT, we would include whether or not there were guaranteed updates from the manufacturer up to a certain point. And the idea of whether or not part of the process of declaring something safe is providing for future safe updates. I'd love to know your response on this, Chia.
First, maybe I answer to Stephen's point. Actually, as I mentioned earlier on, actually, we took the principles of don't let perfection be the enemy of good. I think a labeled product is still better than a not labeled product at its core. And I think the flexibility of a four-level, a kind of a four-label scheme is that it's flexible, and actually over time you can nudge the suppliers, the developers, actually to meet higher cybersecurity requirement when the conditions is right. And I also want to go to, I think, the earlier point about the consumer's reaction. In the sense that I think the consumer's reactions actually remain to be seen, but it's interesting that prior to us actually introducing the cybersecurity labeling scheme, actually we did conduct a consumer survey, and that's actually also I noted that actually in UK a similar consumer survey was actually also conducted, and I think it gave us additional confidence when we push for the labeling scheme, as actually most of the consumers are actually things that actually is a good idea. And in fact, the statistic highlighted they are willing to pay a little bit more for that. I think that, but I think in real world, I think it remains to be seen. I mean, we have the cybersecurity labeling scheme operationalized, and we are eagerly also monitoring the conditions. And I think on Stephen's later points and your question about safety, I think clearly in our cybersecurity scheme, currently it is actually a 3-year support validity, which means the developers is required to keep their software updated, and that's related to especially I think safety or any vulnerabilities. and where there is reported vulnerability or exploitations, then they have to do a patch in a timely manner. Thanks.
Absolutely. I'd love to wrap us up with one last thought, if possible. One of the best questions I've seen in the Q&A, I love all the questions, this one's a really good one, is what is the user's responsibility to educate themselves? And at what point do you meet the user with providing the relevant information? And then we expect the user to make those good decisions. I would very much love to know if anyone has a very short, perhaps 30-second response on that. If you want to raise your hand either just this way or with the function inside the chat, I would love to know if you have a thought on that, if anyone does.
It doesn't. Say
go ahead.
Sorry, I'd raise my hand in the old-fashioned way.
Go for it.
It's a bit like driving a car, right? So we got through the problems of the danger of cars with a mix of regulation, improving the design of cars, and what we would call consumer awareness, making people take a driving test. I'm not suggesting we make buyers of IoT stuff, gadgets take a driving test, but it'll be a mix of those things. I think what we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking is that raising consumer awareness alone is going to be enough. It won't work.
Thank you. I very appreciate it. And I believe, Ursula, if you could close us out with just a single sentence would be lovely, if possible.
Yeah, I think consumers have and users have a role to play, but it cannot be their responsibility because currently they don't have choice. There is no choice very often for a secure product. They just buy something, they have no idea. There is no information around what is really the security. Is it enough for the purposes? And that's really the problem. So again, I have to say, market needs to improve. Thank you.
I think we've had a spirited debate here today, and I am so appreciative of all of our panelists, Atsushi, Chia, Ursula, Neville, Stephen. It's been a joy and a pleasure to be here with you today. We have certainly learned an incredible amount and gotten a lot of wonderful perspectives out there. Thank you to your respective countries. It's been a joy to be here with you today. For the audience, please follow up. I'll be on Twitter answering a couple of questions in a moment too, for anyone who continues the debate. We look forward to it. Thank you to the OECD. It's been a pleasure. Bye for now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tarah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Much.